2 a.m., March 10th, 1945. The Erpel tree line, looking down at the Remagen bridgehead. Private John slams his cracked, bleeding hands against the frozen receiver of an M16 turret, through the freezing rain and the thick, heavy fog. Barely 100 yards away, the grey silhouettes of the Waffen-SS are creeping forward. Silent, bayonets fixed, closing in on the exhausted American infantry. The order from command had crackled through the radio hours ago. It was absolute. Hold your fire. Maintain anti-air positions. No tracers. That quad-mount 50 caliber is the only thing protecting the Ludendorff Bridge from German dive bombers. If John squeezes that butterfly trigger, 4 barrels will light up the night sky like a beacon. The German 88s will zero in on that light and turn his open-topped half-track into a burning coffin in a matter of seconds. But if he doesn't shoot, the boys in the foxholes up ahead will have their throats cut in the dark. Why would a 19-year-old kid tear up a direct order, risk a court-martial, and turn himself into a sitting duck for the entire German army? The 60 seconds that followed wasn't some glorious textbook victory. It was a chaotic, bloody nightmare that broke Hitler's most elite counterattack. The bridge at Remagen wasn't held by generals drawing arrows on a map. It was held by a lone crew, an anti-aircraft gun forced to become a meat chopper, and a desperate gamble that changed the survivors forever. You don't read about the cold in the history books. When you watch the old black-and-white newsreels about the Battle of Remagen, they show you the glorious triumph. They show American tanks rumbling across the Ludendorff Bridge. They show generals smoking cigars, pointing at maps, talking about how they finally pierced the heart of the German homeland. They don't show you the mud. They don't tell you about the kind of cold that freezes the blood in your veins and turns a 19-year-old boy into an old man in a single week. On the east bank of the Rhine River, in the second week of March 1945, the winter was putting up a fight just as vicious as the German army. It wasn't just snowing. It was a miserable, relentless, freezing rain mixed with sleet that soaked right through the heavy wool of an American infantryman's overcoat. In the dense, shattered pine forests of the Erpel perimeter, the men of the forward infantry companies weren't thinking about Berlin. They weren't thinking about medals or strategy. They were just trying to survive until sunrise. The cold was a physical weight. It seeped into your marrow and stayed there. Men were huddled in shallow foxholes, half filled with freezing water. In the pitch black of the night, you could hear the quiet, agonizing sounds of soldiers unlacing their soaked combat boots. They were desperately massaging their swollen purple toes, terrified of the one thing that took more men off the line than German bullets: trench foot. They knew if they stopped moving, the tissue in their feet would literally die and rot. But if they stood up to move around, a German sniper would put a bullet through their helmets. Breakfast, lunch, and dinner was a standard-issue K ration. But in that tree line, the small tins of chopped pork and egg yolk were frozen as hard as a hockey puck. You couldn't build a fire to heat it up. A single match struck in the dark would draw a mortar barrage. So, you had to stick the freezing tin inside your armpit, or hold it in your bare hands, just waiting for your own shivering body heat to melt it enough so you could swallow it without breaking your teeth. And sitting right in the middle of this absolute freezing misery, 50 yards behind the infantry, was the M16 half-track. It was never designed for this kind of war. The M16 was a thoroughbred anti-aircraft weapon. It was built to track fast-moving fighter planes against a clear blue sky. But here it was, bogged down up to its axles in the frozen German mud, its heavy steel treads caked in thick, heavy ice. For the 4 men crewing that machine, there was no place to hide. A Sherman tank crew at least had a steel box to sit inside. They had engine heat. The M16 had nothing. The back of the half-track, and the massive Maxim M45 turret sitting in the center of it, were completely open to the sky. If you were the gunner, you sat in a canvas bucket seat, totally exposed to the sleet and the wind. The cold metal of the turret ring acted like a giant heat sink, pulling whatever warmth you had left right out of your legs. Your breath plumed in the air, freezing into tiny ice crystals on your eyelashes. But the cold wasn't just torturing the men. It was actively trying to destroy the weapon. The heavy M2 Browning 50 caliber machine gun is a masterpiece of engineering, but it requires lubrication to run smoothly. In sub-zero temperatures, the standard gun oil didn't just thicken, it turned into a heavy, useless paste. The mechanisms were freezing solid. To keep the 4 heavy barrels from jamming, the crew had to do the unthinkable. They stripped the thin, scratchy wool blankets off their own shivering backs. They wrapped those blankets tight around the steel receivers of the guns. They hugged the cold metal, sacrificing their own body heat, treating those 4 heavy machine guns better than they treated themselves. Every hour, on the hour, a loader had to crawl up from the freezing mud, pull out a trench knife and carefully crack the ice off the metal ammunition feed chutes. If they had to fire, and those belts of heavy ammunition snapped because of the ice, the whole crew would be dead. They were exhausted. They were blind in the fog. And they were utterly alone. The radios were dead. The heavy SCR 500 batteries had drained hours ago in the sub-zero temperatures, leaving the forward infantry companies completely cut off from battalion command. Their only connection to the rear was a single, fragile copper wire running back through the mud to a crank-operated field telephone. They were utterly isolated, and in that terrifying, freezing silence, they knew exactly who was hunting them. You see, by the spring of 1945, the standard German army, the Wehrmacht, was bleeding to death. The American GIs pushing into Germany were getting used to taking thousands of prisoners a day. Most of the time, when an American patrol walked into a German village, they were met by exhausted old men in ill-fitting uniforms, or terrified 14-year-old boys who were just grateful the war was finally over for them. But the men ordered to push the Americans back into the Rhine River at Remagen were a completely different breed. These were the diehards, the fanatics, the Waffen-SS. These were hardened, indoctrinated killers who had survived the meat grinder of the Eastern Front. They knew the Allies had just pierced the heart of the German homeland. The war was lost, but that didn't make them surrender. It made them dangerous. They were fighting with the cold, vicious desperation of a cornered predator. And a veteran SS combat patrol doesn't attack like regular infantry. They didn't announce their presence with a massive, earth-shattering artillery barrage. They knew that if they made a sound, the American artillery spotters across the river would call down a storm of high explosives and obliterate them in the tree line. So they used the dark. They used the heavy, freezing fog rolling off the Rhine, a thick mist that smelled like wet decay and old cordite. They employed strict infiltration tactics. They didn't march, they didn't run. They crawled. Hundreds of grey-clad phantoms creeping forward on their bellies through the freezing mud, moving inches at a time. They communicated entirely by touch and silent hand signals. They didn't even have their bayonets fixed to their Mauser rifles. A bayonet catches the moonlight. A bayonet makes a distinct metallic scrape when you pull it from a steel scabbard. And in the dead of night, a metallic scrape is a death sentence. Instead, the SS troops carried their Feldspaten, the standard short-handled entrenching shovel. They had spent the afternoon sitting in the rear, quietly grinding the steel edges of those shovels against river rocks until they were as sharp as butcher knives. It is a brutal, primitive, and entirely silent weapon. It was designed for one specific purpose: to slip into an American foxhole in the pitch black, drop onto the back of an exhausted, freezing GE, and end his life before he could even draw breath to scream. That was the nightmare slowly crawling through the woods toward the American line. For the young Americans huddled in the dirt, the waiting was a psychological torture worse than any bombardment. Veterans will tell you that a noisy battlefield is something your brain can process. When the artillery is falling and the machine guns are chattering, your adrenaline takes over. You have a target. You have a direction. But the dead silence of a frozen, foggy forest, that will break a man's mind. Your eyes start to play tricks on you in the mist. Every shadow shifting in the wind looks like a German helmet. Every snap of a frozen pine branch sounds like the crack of a sniper's rifle. You stop breathing just so you can listen harder. You strain your ears until they ring, trying to hear the faint rustle of damp wool or the soft squelch of a boot pressing into the mud. The silence wasn't empty. It was heavy. It was suffocating. The boys in the foxholes couldn't see them yet. But they could feel them. The enemy was closing the distance. 100 yards, 75 yards. And sitting exactly 50 yards behind those terrified infantrymen, the four-man crew of the M16 half-track stared blindly into the fog, their hands frozen to their weapons, completely unaware that they were about to become the only thing standing between the American line and a total massacre. Sitting in the gunner's seat of an M16 half-track is an exercise in profound vulnerability. If you are a tanker in a Sherman, you have inches of rolled homogeneous steel between you and the enemy. You have the roar of a V8 engine to drown out your thoughts. But on the back of the M16, the 19-year-old gunner was strapped into a canvas bucket seat, completely suspended in the open air. His boots rested heavily on the dead man pedals. His stiff, frozen fingers were tightly wrapped around the twin control grips. Surrounding him were 4 heavy Browning barrels, each chambered in .50 caliber. It was a machine capable of unleashing absolute devastation, but in that moment it was completely paralyzed. To power the heavy electric motors that rotated that massive turret, the M16 relied on a small, one-cylinder gasoline generator bolted to the deck. A little putt-putt motor. If you leave that motor running, it makes a steady, rhythmic puttering noise. A mechanical heartbeat that carries for miles in the quiet of a winter night. A noise that tells every German soldier creeping through the woods exactly where the highest value target on the line is parked. So they had to leave it off. That meant if the gunner suddenly needed to swing those guns around to save his own life, he couldn't just press a pedal. Without power, the turret was just dead weight. Over 2,000 pounds of freezing steel, locked in place. The loader, crouching in the ankle-deep mud beside the half-track, had his bare, freezing hand resting on the wooden handle of the generator's pull cord. Just waiting. Sweating freezing droplets of water under his steel pot helmet. He knew that the second he yanked that cord and the engine sputtered to life, they were painting a giant bullseye on their own backs. Then, breaking the suffocating silence, the heavy crank-operated field telephone sitting in the bed of the half-track gave a dull, muted buzz. The squad leader grabbed the heavy black receiver, pressing it tight against his ear to block out the howling wind. It was the infantry platoon leader from the foxholes 50 yards ahead. He wasn't yelling. He was speaking in a frantic, breathless whisper. "We can smell them." The SS infiltrators were so close, the American boys pressed into the dirt could literally smell the damp wool of their German field jackets. They could smell the stale tobacco on their breath. They were about to be overrun. They needed fire support, and they needed it right now. The squad leader looked at the phone. Then he looked at his 19-year-old gunner. The standing orders from Anti-Aircraft Battalion Command were absolute. They had been drilled into the crew's heads for weeks. Do not fire at ground targets. Maintain radio silence. Do not reveal your position under any circumstances. The brass sitting in the warm command tents miles behind the river only cared about one thing. The Ludendorff Bridge. It was the only bridge still standing across the Rhine, and the German Luftwaffe was throwing every dive bomber they had at it. The M16s were placed on that hill to create an umbrella of lead in the sky. If this crew opened fire on infantry, it wouldn't just be loud. The ammunition belts feeding those 4 Brownings were loaded with a mix of armor-piercing and tracer rounds. Every 5th bullet was a tracer that burned bright crimson in the dark. If they pulled the trigger, 4 solid rivers of red light would shoot out into the forest. It would be a neon sign pointing right back at their half-track. And directly across the river valley, sitting on the opposite ridge, were batteries of German 88mm flak guns, the deadliest artillery piece of the war. They were just waiting for a target to reveal itself. Because the M16 had no roof, only a thin sheet of 1/4-inch steel on the front shield, a single 88mm high-explosive shell detonating anywhere near them would instantly turn the entire crew into pink mist. Even a single stick grenade tossed into the open bed by a passing German soldier would be a death sentence. It was a paralyzing, agonizing paradox. If the crew followed orders and stayed hidden, they would live to see the morning. But they would have to sit there in the dark and listen to the boys in the infantry get butchered with sharpened shovels just 50 yards away. But if they pulled the trigger, they would save the infantry and invite the wrath of the entire German artillery corps right onto their own unarmored heads. They would face a court-martial if they survived the blast. You know, when I dig through these old action reports, I often have to pause for a beat. We sit here today, in the quiet warmth and peace of our homes, talking about decisions made by 19- and 20-year-old kids, young men who were forced to sit on a freezing piece of steel in the dead of night and weigh their own lives against the lives of the brothers bleeding in the mud a few yards away. They didn't have a textbook to consult. They didn't have time for a committee. It wasn't just history to them. It was everything. If you feel a deep, profound respect for that greatest generation, just like I do, please leave a like on this video. It's just a small gesture, but it's how we stand together, tip our hats, and make sure the fire of their courage never really goes out. The squad leader slowly lowered the field phone back into its cradle. He didn't call command to ask for permission. He didn't check the rule book. He just looked down at the loader gripping the pull cord of the generator, and he gave a single, sharp nod. The loader yanked the heavy pull cord. For a terrifying, agonizing second, nothing happened. Then the little gasoline engine sputtered, coughed on the freezing, damp air, and suddenly roared to life with a loud, rhythmic, mechanical rattle. Out in the darkness, the faint rustling in the woods instantly stopped. The Germans heard it. The element of surprise was completely gone. The veteran SS troops creeping through the mud knew exactly what that sound meant. It wasn't a jeep. It wasn't a supply truck. It was a generator. And on an American front line, a generator meant one thing: a mechanized anti-aircraft battery. Down in the shallow foxholes, the American infantrymen didn't cheer. They didn't look back. They pressed their faces deep into the freezing dirt, wrapped their arms over their helmets, and opened their mouths to keep the overpressure from blowing out their eardrums. They knew what was about to happen. On the back of the half-track, the 19-year-old gunner slammed his heavy winter boots down onto the dead man pedals. The electric motors screamed, a high-pitched metallic shriek that cut right through the fog, as the massive 2-ton turret was violently jolted awake. It swung forward with brutal speed. The 4 heavy steel barrels locked dead level with the tree line, pointing straight into the black void. His frozen fingers clamped down hard on the butterfly triggers, and the gates of hell blew wide open. It didn't sound like 4 separate machine guns firing. It didn't have the rhythmic rat-tat-tat you hear in Hollywood movies. When 4 M2 Brownings fire simultaneously at a combined rate of 2,000 rounds a minute, the sound waves compress. It merges into a single, deafening, continuous roar that sounds like a massive sheet of heavy canvas being violently ripped in half. It was a physical wall of noise that hit you squarely in the chest and rattled the teeth in your skull. Every fifth round loaded into those belts was an armor-piercing incendiary tracer. In the pitch black of the German forest, those 4 barrels pumped out a solid, blinding river of crimson light. It illuminated the tree line like a strobe light in a slaughterhouse. Through the thick, choking grey smoke of the muzzle flashes, the gunner could finally see them. The grey coats. Dozens of them. Hundreds of them. Caught completely exposed in the open, standing upright in the fog, frozen in the glare of the tracers. There is no infantry tactic in the world, no amount of fanatical SS indoctrination, and no amount of combat experience that can stand up to a concentrated wall of 50 caliber fire. You have to understand what a 50 caliber round actually is. This wasn't a standard rifle bullet. It was a piece of brass and lead the size of a man's hand, originally designed to punch straight through the armored engine block of an incoming fighter plane. When a round like that hits a full-grown pine tree, it doesn't just pass through. It violently shatters the trunk, turning the tree itself into a bomb of massive, lethal wooden splinters that shower the men hiding behind it. And when a round like that hits a human body, it doesn't wound. It simply removes whatever part of the man it touches. The frozen earth was chewed up and violently spit into the air. The SS assault column didn't retreat. It simply disintegrated. But keeping that monster fed and firing was a completely different kind of nightmare. Each of the 4 tombstone magazines bolted to the turret held 200 rounds. At that terrifying rate of fire, pulling the trigger down meant the guns would run dry in roughly 24 seconds. The 2 loaders working in the back of the open half-track were fighting for their lives against their own machine. Within seconds, the steel floor of the deck was completely flooded with a river of boiling hot, empty brass casings. It was like trying to run on burning marbles in the dark. The loaders slipped. They fell hard to their knees on the jagged brass. The searing heat of the casings began to melt through the frozen mud on their boots. Their hands were bleeding. Their knuckles busted wide open against the freezing steel of the turret as it violently swung back and forth. They were completely deafened, their ears bleeding from the concussion of the muzzles right above their heads. To reload, they had to grab fresh ammunition cans, heavy steel boxes weighing 45 pounds each, heave them up chest-high into the gun mounts, violently slam them into place, and lock the feed chutes, all while the turret was moving and the deafening roar of the guns threatened to shake them to pieces. If they made one mistake, if they threaded the belt in crooked, the gun would jam, and the Germans would overrun them. The gunner couldn't hear them screaming. He couldn't hear the Germans. He just kept his foot firmly pressed on the pedal, sweeping the heavy turret left and right in a wide, sweeping arc, hosing down the tree line. He wasn't thinking about medals. He wasn't thinking about the court-martial he was going to face for breaking orders. He was just a kid, surviving, holding the triggers down until the steel barrels glowed a dull cherry red in the dark, and the paint on the receivers literally began to blister and peel from the immense heat. And then, as abruptly as the nightmare had started, the gunner let off the triggers. The heavy electric motors spun down with a dying metallic whine. The sudden silence that fell over the forest was almost as deafening as the gunfire. It wasn't the heavy, suffocating silence of the ambush anymore. It was the hollow, ringing silence of a graveyard. The only sound left in the world was the sharp hiss of the freezing winter rain hitting the red-hot steel barrels of the Brownings, instantly flashing into steam. Thick, choking clouds of grey cordite hung low and heavy in the damp night air, burning the backs of the men's throats. The 19-year-old gunner slowly peeled his hands off the control grips. His fingers were locked into tight, rigid claws. He had to physically pry them open. He was shaking violently against the canvas seat, his chest heaving, gasping for air as the massive adrenaline crash hit his body like a physical blow. Below him, the loaders just collapsed onto their backs right there in the bed of the half-track, lying on top of a foot-deep pile of smoking, jagged brass casings. They stared up at the freezing rain falling on their faces, totally spent. Out in the tree line, nothing moved. No return fire, no shouts in German, no more rustling in the dark. Down in the mud, the American infantrymen slowly lifted their steel pots from the dirt. They peered over the edge of their shallow foxholes, their eyes wide, trying to pierce through the lingering gun smoke. The dense pine forest in front of them had been completely leveled. Trees as thick as a man's torso were shredded into toothpicks. The frozen ground was churned into an unrecognizable landscape of shattered wood and smoking craters. And the elite Waffen-SS assault column, the hardened killers who had come to slit their throats in the dark, they were gone. The attack was broken and completely destroyed in under 60 seconds. The M16 crew didn't cheer. The infantry in the dirt didn't holler or celebrate. There is no cheering on a real battlefield when you've just witnessed that level of absolute, terrifying destruction. There is only a profound, heavy exhaustion, and the quiet, stunning realization that you somehow get to take another breath. You know, when you strip away the propaganda and the Hollywood myths, you realize something very profound about combat. In the end, war isn't decided by the technical specifications of a machine. It's not about muzzle velocity or armor thickness. It is decided by the breaking point of ordinary men. And the greatest, most heartbreaking tragedy of the American soldier is that sometimes a good man is forced to unleash absolute, unspeakable hell just to ensure the brothers fighting next to him get to go home alive. That night, a crew of kids broke the rules. They ignored the brass. They risked a court-martial and a firing squad. But because they did, a thin line of freezing infantry held their ground, and the Remagen bridgehead survived the night. The official history books are usually written in bright, warm rooms by generals with stars on their collars. They write about the grand strategies, the sweeping supply lines, and the glorious, sweeping victories. But the real truth of the Second World War, the freezing, terrifying truth, is buried in the mud. It lives entirely in the memories of the men who actually had to sit on that cold steel, look into the dark, and pull the trigger. That crew of the M16, they never got a ticker-tape parade for what they did that night in the Urpel Forest. They didn't make the front page of the New York Times. In fact, I wouldn't be surprised if some rear echelon officer marched up the hill the next morning and tried to chew them out for breaking radio silence and firing without direct orders. But the infantrymen climbing out of those half-flooded foxholes didn't care about rear echelon orders. They knew that 4 freezing kids on an open-topped half-track had just handed them their lives back. The line held. And because that thin, ragged line held, the Ludendorff Bridge stood long enough for the Allied armor to pour across the Rhine River and finally drive a stake right into the heart of the Nazi regime. You know, a lot of you watching this right now, you don't need a history book or a documentary to tell you what these men were made of, because it was your father, it was your uncle, or your grandfather. They were the ones who came back, quietly carrying the truest stories of that war. Those vivid, heavy memories they maybe only shared over the family dinner table after a couple of drinks, or the stories that just slipped out when they were staring off into the distance on a quiet Sunday afternoon. Stories of unimaginable fear, of quiet, stubborn bravery, and of a bond of brotherhood that no Hollywood movie could ever truly capture. I know those stories are out there, and I really, truly want to hear them. Please, don't let those priceless pieces of your family's legacy just fade away with time. Take a moment and share your father or grandfather's story down in the comments below. Let's create a place right here where we can all listen, remember, and honor the men who gave so much for us to be sitting here today. Thank you for taking the time to sit down and remember with me today. Welcome home, brothers, and I'll see you in the next one.